The Waitemata Harbor doesn't forgive mistakes. It takes them. And as the cold current pulled me under that gray Auckland morning, I understood with absolute clarity that the man I had trusted with my daughter's happiness had been planning this for a very long time. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I am 67 years old, a retired district court judge from Devonport, and I spent 4 decades reading people for a living. I measured guilt in the set of a jaw, in the stillness of hands that wanted to move, in the particular way a liar's eyes would find the ceiling instead of mine. I had sent men to prison on the strength of what I could read in a face. And yet I had sat across a dinner table from my son-in-law for 6 years and seen nothing but a man who loved my daughter. That is the mistake that nearly killed me. It was a Tuesday in early June, one of those Wellington cold mornings that Auckland sometimes borrows in winter, when the harbor turns the color of old pewter and the wind comes off the water with teeth. I had been walking the Devonport foreshore since Helen died. It was the only thing that quieted the particular silence of a house built for 2 people now occupied by 1. My routine was exact. Out by 5:30, along the waterfront path, back before 8. Kieran knew this. He had asked me about it himself. Standing in my kitchen the previous Christmas, stirring his coffee with that easy smile, asking whether I ever worried about the rocks along the lower path being slippery in winter. I told him no. I was careful. He nodded slowly and said he was glad to hear it. I did not think about that conversation again until I was underwater. I never heard him behind me. The path curves near the old ferry terminal, and the railing there is original ironwork, salt-pitted and old. And when my shoulder connected with it, the metal gave way, as though it had been waiting for exactly this weight at exactly this angle. One moment I was walking, the next I was falling, and then the harbor was everywhere, inside my coat, inside my lungs, and the cold was not a temperature, but a decision pressing down on me with the quiet certainty of something that had already made up its mind. A woman named Sandra Ngata pulled me out. She was 51 years old, a nurse from Takapuna who ran the foreshore every morning regardless of weather. She told the paramedics she had seen a figure on the path above me immediately before I went in. By the time the ambulance arrived, that figure was crouching at the waterline, phone to his ear, calling emergency services in a voice stretched tight with the performance of panic. "My father-in-law," Kieran said, his voice carrying across the water with practiced grief. "I think he slipped. Please, hurry." I tried to speak. My throat held nothing but harbor water. Kieran rode in the ambulance and held my hand. He leaned down near my ear while the paramedic was checking equipment and said, very quietly, in a voice like gravel wrapped in velvet, "Just rest, Gerald. You've been under a lot of stress since Helen." I looked at him. I held his eyes for 3 full seconds. He did not look away. He simply smiled and patted my hand and turned to answer a question from the paramedic about my medications. At Auckland City Hospital, the emergency physician was a young woman named Dr. Priya Mehta who spoke to my son-in-law instead of to me for the first 10 minutes of my assessment. Kieran had established the narrative before I arrived. 70-year-old widower, still grieving, increasingly confused since the loss of his wife 14 months ago, had mentioned feeling unsteady on the foreshore path several times recently. The word confused appeared 3 times in the first 5 minutes. Each time I tried to correct something, Kieran would exhale softly, the sigh of a devoted family member bearing a heavy weight, and the doctor's gaze would drift back to him. "Gerald," he said, leaning over me while the doctor reviewed her notes, his face blocking out the fluorescent light, his voice dropping below the threshold of anyone else in the room. "You're confused right now. It's the shock. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I am a former district court judge. I have heard 6,000 lies. I know exactly what a threat, dressed in concern, sounds like. You pushed me," I said. and my voice came out thin and waterlogged and nothing like the voice that had commanded courtrooms for 4 decades. Kieran straightened up and turned to the doctor with an expression of exhausted, loving patience that I recognized from the faces of accomplished liars everywhere. "He's been saying things like this since Helen died," he said quietly. "His GP has been worried. They sedated me for the night. My daughter, Natalie, came in the morning. She was 41 years old, and she looked 10 years older than that, wearing the particular tiredness of a woman who had been frightened for a long time and had learned to carry it as something else. She had Kieran's hand in hers when she walked through the door. She sat beside my bed and told me I was coming to stay with them in Remuera while I recovered. She said it the way you tell a child something that is not open for discussion. I had built that house on Remuera Road in my mind as the place my grandchildren would grow up. Natalie and Kieran had bought it 3 years ago, a large double-brick colonial that needed work. I had thought of it as an investment in family. I understood. Now, it had been an investment in something else entirely. "I want to go home," I said. Natalie looked at Kieran. "Of course you do," Kieran said warmly. "We'll talk about it once you're feeling better." My phone had been in my coat pocket when I went into the harbor. It did not survive. Kieran had already ordered me a replacement, he said. He would set it up for me. The room they gave me at the Remuera house was on the upper floor, at the end of a corridor, separated from the main living areas by 2 closed doors and a staircase that creaked differently depending on which board you used. I noticed that within an hour of arrival, my body still knew how to catalog detail even when the rest of me was moving through fog. The house smelled of new paint. Not fresh paint, the bright, clean smell of a recent renovation, but something older and more chemical, a heavy industrial smell that clung to the walls of my room in particular and seemed to intensify after the heating came on. I am not a doctor, but I spent decades listening to expert witnesses, and I knew that certain compounds used in older building materials, when disturbed or reapplied over existing surfaces, could produce exactly the kind of low-grade cognitive symptoms that Kieran had been describing to every medical professional who would listen. Headache, difficulty concentrating, confusion. I opened my window as far as the latch would allow, and sat in the chair beside it and breathed the cold Remuera air and thought about what I knew. What I knew was very little. What I suspected was enough to kill me. The children found me before dinner. My grandson, Callum, was 11 years old. He had Helen's eyes and my habit of watching a room before entering it. He came to the doorway of my bedroom and stood there for a moment, assessing, and then he came in and sat on the edge of the bed without being invited, which was exactly what I would have done at his age. "You should know the camera is in the smoke detector," he said, without preamble, nodding toward the ceiling fixture near the door. "Dad put it in last week. Before you came, I looked at the smoke detector. Then, at my grandson." "How do you know that?" I asked. "Because I watched him do it," Callum said. He was not frightened when he said this. He was careful, which is a different thing entirely, and considerably more alarming in a child. "He told me it was for your safety, but he put it in before Mom even called you about coming to stay." We held each other's eyes for a moment. "Is your sister all right?" I asked. "Poppy is fine. She doesn't understand what's happening." He paused. "I do, though." He left before I could answer, slipping back into the corridor with the same quiet deliberateness he had arrived with. But as he reached the door, he stopped without turning around and said, in a voice so low I had to lean forward, "Don't eat the soup tonight. I'll explain later." I pushed the soup around the bowl at dinner and did not eat it, and watched Kieran watch me from the head of the table with the satisfied patience of a man awaiting confirmation of something he already believed to be true. Kieran Alderton was 44 years old. He had come to Wellington 9 years ago from Christchurch with a property investment background, a talent for making numbers sound like stories, and a smile that arrived slightly before his words, as though his face had been briefed in advance. He had met Natalie at a charity function. He had charmed her thoroughly and efficiently, and proposed within 14 months, and I had stood at the front of Devonport Presbyterian and watched my daughter look at him the way people look at things that are too bright to see clearly. I had liked him. That was the part I returned to, sitting at the dinner table, moving cold soup around a bowl. I had genuinely liked him. That night, after the house went quiet, Callum came back. He came through the door without a sound and sat beside me on the bed and handed me a folded piece of paper. The paper was a printed email chain. 4 pages. The heading of a private investment firm I did not recognize, and my son-in-law's name appearing repeatedly, alongside a figure that appeared in several variations but always hovered near the same number. $2.8 million. Outstanding. Demand notice. Final. Where did you get this? I asked. His office, Callum said. He locks it, but the lock is old. I used a butter knife. He said this with no particular pride, only the flat practicality of someone who had decided that ordinary rules applied to ordinary situations. There's more. A folder. With your name on it? I looked at my grandson in the dim light and felt something move in my chest that I did not have an immediate word for. It was somewhere between terror and pride and grief, that a boy of 11 years should have learned, in his own home, to move like this. Show me, I said. We went down the corridor together. Callum knew which boards to avoid. He had mapped the house the way I had mapped courtrooms, identifying the structural pressures before anything went wrong. He produced the butter knife and worked the lock with a concentration that suggested considerable prior practice, and the office door swung open onto a room that smelled of stale coffee and the particular cold of a space that is used in secret. 3 screens. Files everywhere. And on the corner of the desk, a leather folder with my name written on the tab in Kieran's handwriting. I opened it with steady hands, because I had 30 years of practice opening things that contained information capable of destroying people's lives. The first document was an insurance policy. My life. $2.4 million. Kieran Alderton listed as sole beneficiary through a trust arrangement structured to appear legitimate to a surface examination. The policy had been taken out 11 months ago, the same week Helen's estate was finalized. The second document was a power of attorney. I looked at my signature at the bottom of the page. I had not signed this document. I had, however, signed a birthday card for Natalie 8 months ago, sitting at this same kitchen table, using a pen Kieran handed me. I had thought nothing of it at the time. I thought about it now. The third document was what took the air from the room entirely. It was a medical assessment, written on letterhead from a private cognitive health clinic in Parnell, dated 5 months ago, diagnosing me with moderate cognitive decline, consistent with early-stage vascular dementia. The assessment referenced 3 clinical appointments. I had attended none of them. The signature at the bottom belonged to a Dr. Ross Fentiman. I had never met a Dr. Ross Fentiman in my life. Callum pointed to a secondary folder underneath the first. Inside it were 2 death certificates and 2 newspaper clippings folded around them like envelopes. The first was for a woman named Margaret Coburn, 68 years old, of Nelson, drowning, boating accident, Lake Rotowide, 2016. Married 11 months prior to a man whose name in the clipping did not match Kieran's, but whose photograph, small and slightly blurred, was a face I knew. The second was for a woman named Denise Farrow, 71 years old, of Hamilton, found in her home swimming pool, 2019. Accidental. Recent marriage. The photograph in this clipping was clearer. I sat down on the floor of my son-in-law's locked office, because my legs required it, and held those 2 pieces of paper, and understood that I was not a victim of a desperate man. I was the third project of a professional, Callum crouched beside me. He did not say anything. He put his hand over mine, cold and small and steady, and waited. "We need to put everything back exactly as we found it," I said, when I could speak again. He nodded once, already reaching for the folders. "Callum," I said, "does your mother know?" He was quiet for a moment. "She knows something is wrong," he said finally, "but she's scared of what it is." The next 4 days were the most precise performance of my life, and I had spent 4 decades performing precision under pressure. I played the confused elderly widower so completely that Kieran began to relax. I watched him relax the way you watch water find its level, gradually, irreversibly, until he was moving through the house with the loose confidence of a man who believes the hardest work is behind him. He brought me tea every morning. I thanked him and poured it into the pot plant by the window when he left. He had a woman named Carol visit, introduced as a support worker from a community health organization. She asked me questions for 40 minutes and wrote things down. I answered with the careful vagueness of someone whose grip on the present had loosened just enough to require management. When she left, I heard Kieran on the phone in the hallway. Exactly what we needed. The application goes in Thursday. Natalie moved through the house like someone waiting for a verdict she already knew was coming. I watched her at dinner, at breakfast, sitting with Poppy on the sofa in the evenings. She was not a villain. I had raised her, and I knew the difference. She was a woman who had borrowed money she did not have, signed documents she had not fully read, and told herself, in the way that people do, that understanding less was a form of protection. I needed to reach her, but I needed to reach her at the right moment, in the right way, without Kieran in the room. Callum made that possible. On the Thursday morning, Kieran left the house at 8:15 to meet with someone he described as a financial advisor. 20 minutes later, Callum brought Natalie a coffee, and then quietly, with the directness of someone who had rehearsed the moment, told her, "Mum, Poppy and I need you to sit with Grandpa. Just you, right now." I was sitting at the kitchen table when she came in. I had the folder in front of me. The performance was over. I watched her read the insurance policy. I watched her read the power of attorney. I watched her face do what faces do when the architecture of a life collapses. Not all at once, but in sections, the way old buildings go, one load-bearing element at a time. "He told me it was a standard estate planning document," she said. When she got to the power of attorney, her voice was almost inaudible. "He said your solicitor had recommended it. He said you'd already discussed it." "My solicitor has not been contacted," I said. "The signature is a forgery." She turned to the medical assessment from Dr. Ross Fentiman. "I've never been to that clinic," I said. "I have never met that doctor. Those appointments do not exist." She reached the photographs of Margaret Coburn and Denise Farrow and stopped. I gave her the time she needed. I had given people time in courtrooms for 30 years. I knew what it looked like when someone was reorganizing everything they knew about everything. And I knew that rushing that process was the only way to lose the moment entirely. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red and her hands were shaking, and she said, "The lake house. He's been talking about taking you to the Taupo property this weekend. Just the two of you. He said it would be good for your recovery." I said nothing. I let her understand it herself. And I watched the moment she did. "Oh God," she said, very quietly. "Oh, Dad." I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. "I need you to trust me now," I said. "And I need you to be very good at pretending. For a very short time." We had 2 hours before Kieran returned. Callum had already photographed every document in the office on his school iPad and emailed the files to an address I gave him. I retrieved my original will from memory, called my solicitor, Ian Park, on Natalie's phone, and gave him a precise summary in judicial language that required no repetition. Ian had known me for 22 years. He did not ask me if I was sure. He said he would contact the police and that I should stay exactly where I was. Detective Sergeant Aroha Tain arrived at the Remuera house at 11:40. She was 46, with the settled authority of someone who had seen enough to be unsurprisable. And she listened to everything I said, without writing anything down, and then said, "Mr. Whitmore, I need to tell you that we've been looking at Kieran Alderton for 8 weeks. She told me that a family member of Denise Farrow had contacted Auckland police 18 months ago. The investigation had been slow because Alderton was careful, because there were no witnesses, and because the available financial records were structured through enough layers to require specialist forensic accounting. The documents Callum had photographed, particularly the insurance policy and the forged power of attorney, combined with the fabricated medical assessments, represented the clearest direct evidence they had gathered. The medical fraud alone carries significant charges, Tain said. Dr. Fentiman's license was suspended in 2021. He and Alderton have a documented prior relationship. She asked me to do one more thing. She asked me to behave normally until Kieran returned, to give her team 2 hours to position correctly. She said it with the manner of someone asking a favor from a colleague, not managing a frightened civilian, and I appreciated that. I said I had spent 30 years behaving normally while waiting for the right moment. She almost smiled. Kieran came home at 12:50. He stood in the kitchen doorway, handsome and rested, smelling of a good lunch, and looked at me sitting at the table with a cup of tea, and his face arranged itself into the expression of warm concern that I now understood was simply muscle memory, a thing he had done so many times it had become reflexive. "Good morning," he said. "How are you feeling?" "Clearer than I've felt in some time," I said. He paused for just a fraction of a second. Something moved behind his eyes, a brief recalibration. The way a very good chess player adjusts when a piece they expected to be passive makes an unexpected move. "That's great," he said. "Natalie and I were thinking, actually, we might push the Taupo trip up. Leave tomorrow instead of Saturday. The weather looks good on the lake." "The lake," I said. "Beautiful this time of year," he said. "Kieran," I said, "I'd like you to meet Detective Sergeant Tain. She has some questions about a Dr. Ross Fentiman." The kitchen door opened behind him. What followed happened quickly, and with the practiced efficiency of people who had prepared for exactly this. Kieran did not run. He was not the kind of man who ran. He stood very still and said, in a voice from which all warmth had been removed as completely as if a switch had been thrown, "I want my solicitor." Tain advised him of his rights. An officer took his arm. He turned to look at me once before they walked him out, and what was in his face was not anger or fear. It was something closer to professional recognition, the expression of one careful person acknowledging another. He had underestimated me. He knew that, and he knew when a case was closed. Natalie stood in the hallway with Callum, and 8-year-old Poppy pressed against her sides, and she watched her husband walk out of her house in handcuffs, and she did not make a sound. Callum had his arm around his mother's waist. He was watching the doorway with the steady eyes of someone who had already finished grieving something. The weeks that followed moved with the particular slow weight of legal processes. The charges against Kieran Alderton were substantial. Fraud, forgery, attempted murder, and 2 counts of manslaughter arising from the deaths of Margaret Coburn and Denise Farrow, charges that investigators were now confident they could pursue with the supporting financial evidence the search warrant uncovered. Dr. Ross Fentiman was charged separately with fraud and professional misconduct. 4 other individuals connected to the financial scheme received charges ranging from money laundering to conspiracy. Natalie's situation was considered carefully. She had signed certain documents without full knowledge of their purpose. She had not reported concerns she should perhaps have reported. Her cooperation with police was complete and immediate. The prosecutor's office, following review, determined that the evidence did not support criminal charges against her, though she was required to give full testimony. She did so without hesitation, for 3 hours, in a voice that did not waver. The civil proceedings to recover the forged power of attorney and dissolve the fraudulent trust arrangements took 8 months. Ian Park navigated them with the quiet competence of a man who took things like forged signatures as a personal affront. My financial position was restored, substantially intact. I moved back to my house in Devonport in September. The foreshore railing near the old ferry terminal was replaced by the Auckland Council in August. New steel, properly anchored, tested to specification. I had submitted a formal report to the council in July, noting that the original ironwork had shown evidence of deliberate corrosion at the mounting points. I had included photographs. I'm Luden 77. I had been a judge long enough to know that formal records matter, and that informal conversations do not. I walk the same path every morning. I have not stopped. You do not let a man who is in custody determine which paths you take. Callum comes to stay with me in the school holidays. He is learning to sail, which seems appropriate for a boy who grew up on a harbor. Poppy draws pictures at my kitchen table and talks constantly, which fills the house with exactly the kind of noise it has needed since Helen died. Natalie comes for dinner on Sundays, and we eat properly and talk about things that are real. And sometimes we sit in the backyard after dark and say nothing at all, and that is also something. She asked me once whether I was angry. I thought about it honestly, which is the only way I know how to think about anything. I was a judge for 30 years, I told her. I've watched anger do more damage than the original crime, in more cases than I can count. I'm not angry. I'm clear. Those are different things. She nodded slowly and turned her wine glass in her hands. I should have come to you, she said. When I first started being frightened, I should have come. Yes, I said. You should have. We let that sit between us without softening it, because she deserved honesty more than she needed comfort. And then I said, but you came when it mattered, and so did your son. Callum had received, through a legal process I will not detail here, a formal commendation from Detective Sergeant Taine for his role in the evidence gathering. He had it framed. It hangs in his room in Remuera, next to a photograph of him and Poppy and me on the Devonport ferry, taken on a gray June morning, 6 weeks after everything ended, all 3 of us in coats, looking slightly cold and entirely fine. I look at that photograph sometimes and think about what it cost to get there, and about all the things I should have seen sooner, and about the question Callum asked me on the night we sat on the floor of his father's office together, holding those 2 death certificates. He had asked, quietly, without drama, why didn't someone stop him before? I did not have a good answer that night. I have thought about it since. The honest answer is this: because Margaret Coburn's family thought her drowning was an accident. Because Denise Farrow's children assumed their mother had simply been unlucky. Because when something looks like grief and age and misfortune, we accept it as grief and age and misfortune. Because the alternative requires us to believe something about human nature that is genuinely frightening. We are not built to suspect the people at our table. That is not a weakness. It is what makes ordinary life possible. But there are signs, and they are readable, if you know to look. The person who is more interested in your finances than your feelings. The person who answers questions you have not asked, in rooms where other people are listening. The person who constructs your narrative in front of you, efficiently and without your participation, as though they have rehearsed it and you are merely a prop. The person who manages your access to others while appearing to protect it. These are not proof of anything, individually, but when they appear together, in the home of someone you love, they are worth your attention. They cost nothing to notice. They cost everything to ignore. I was fortunate. I had a grandson who watched rooms before entering them. I had a solicitor who answered on the first ring. I had a detective who had been building a case for 8 weeks before I walked into a police station to help her close it. Not everyone has those things, which means that those of us who do have an obligation not to waste them. Helen left me a note once, tucked into the back of a book I found in the garden shed the summer after she died. She had a habit of writing things down and leaving them in places I would find them slowly. The note said only, "You always knew when something wasn't right. Trust that." I should have trusted it 11 months earlier, standing in my kitchen at Christmas, watching my son-in-law stir his coffee and ask whether I worried about the rocks being slippery in winter. I trust it now, completely and without reservation. The harbor is still there every morning, gray in winter, blue in summer, always moving, always taking the light differently depending on where you stand. I walk its edge, and I think about the people who didn't make it back to shore. And I think about the people who pulled me out of it. And I think about an 11-year-old boy with a butter knife in his grandmother's eyes who decided that ordinary rules applied to ordinary situations, and that this was not one. He was right about that. He has always been right about that. Watch the people at your table. Listen to the children in your house. And when something in you says this is not right, believe it. The way you would believe a foundation crack. The way you would believe a railing that moves when it should not move. The way you would believe anything that tells you, quietly and without drama, that the structure is failing. Trust that before it goes into the water.